Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first retro seminar of this term. My name is Rita Mota, and I'm the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Oxford University Center for Corporate Reputation. With me today is Alan Morrison, Professor of Law and Finance here at the Saïd Business School in Oxford, who co-convenes retro with me, and our guest speaker, Anne-Laure Fayard. Anne-Laure is full professor and the ERA Chair in Social Innovation at Nova School of Business and Economics, and a visiting research professor at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. She's an expert on technology, social innovation, and human and community-centered design, and her research focuses on topics like collaboration, open innovation for social impact, and the effects of technology on innovation and work. Anne-Laure has published very important work on these and other topics in leading journals, and she's also been involved in high-profile social innovation projects. We are very lucky indeed to have Anne-Laure with us today, and I'll turn the floor over to her in a moment, but before I do so, let me say a few quick words about the seminar. Many of you are regular attendees and so have heard much of this before, but for those of you who are here for the first time, let me give you some context. Retro, that is Reputation, Ethics, Trust and Relationships at Oxford, is a seminar series that is concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organizational life. The seminar series started in January 2020, moved online about 2 years ago when the pandemic made in-person events impossible, and has been generously supported by the Center for Corporate Reputation since the beginning. Although many academic events are now back to an in-person format, Alan and I have decided to keep retro online because this is the best way to continue to include people from all over the world. It is undeniable that having such a wonderfully diverse group of people in the virtual room makes for much more stimulating and wide-ranging discussions. So thank you for coming and for being part of this community. And I would also like to thank the people who make retro possible. Rupert Younger, director of the CCR, who's always been supportive of this series in every possible way. Hannah Cooper, Chris Page, Mark Hughes Morgan, and Darius Jawa, who do all of the essential backstage work to make these seminars happen. And of course, Alan, whose knowledge and wisdom have been crucial to the existence and success of the series. Today's seminar addresses the fascinating question of which narratives we use to make sense of technology. As artificial intelligence is deployed in increasingly important areas of our lives, people have been trying to understand just how positively or negatively they should view it. And this isn't easy. Most of us have little or no technical expertise on the subject, and we are constantly bombarded by contradictory claims of technology as the big liberator, or as the most severe existential threat that human beings have faced in many decades. The stories we tell about AI are incredibly relevant. They affect how, when, and where the technology is adopted and how we engage with it. Anne-Laure is going to suggest that it may be useful to think about AI as a monster. Not as a monster that is all evil or all good, but one that combines both features, which, as Anne-Laure will show, is how humans have imagined monsters historically. If we think about AI as a hybrid monster, maybe it will be easier to view the technology more holistically and to reason more effectively about its intended and unintended consequences. I'm very much looking forward to hearing Anne-Laure's views, and I'm sure that we'll have a great discussion after her presentation. Anne-Laure will speak for around 20 to 30 minutes. After that, we will have some time for questions and answers. Most of you already know how this works. Please enter your questions and comments into the Q&A box, not the chat, and either Alan or I will relay them to Anne-Laure. You can find the Q&A button either at the top or at the bottom of your screen, depending on the device that you are using. We're going to finish promptly at 5 p.m. Anne-Laure, thank you so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me just first try to see if I can share. Does it work?
Yep.
Yes. Okay. So thanks a lot, Rita, for the kind introduction, and also thanks to Alan and you for the invitation. I'm very excited to be part of this seminar in this community and to share with you ongoing work that I've been doing with my colleague at NYU, Graham Doe, for a couple of years now. In fact, this paper that I'm going to be talking about today started as more of a paper for managerial or organizational scholars audience, and ended up with two papers. One looking more at the role of monsters in the design of the technology, and this one is published. It's in the proceeding of the CHI, the Computer Human Interaction Conference, and then this paper that is still in process. And so I'm really looking forward to any feedback, suggestions, questions as we're still developing the ideas. And this is part also of a broader research agenda. That led me to a few pieces of work. One which is published in Harvard Business Review on really the AI, the implementation of AI in organizations. And then current work with Callan Anthony and Beth Betschke, both colleagues from NYU, where we've been looking at the role of AI future of work and how ethnography is an important methodology to understand better the consequences of AI. And last, I'd like to recognize the ongoing conversation that I have been having over the last few years with Melchior Tamizier Fayard on the role of monsters and their meanings in different cultures, because they've been really helpful for me and Graham. So let me get started, but Rita gave already a wonderful summary of what I've been trying to do with this paper and with Graham. But so as Rita started saying, like, you know, we've been hearing a lot. I mean, we read, we hear about the role of AI, whether it's AI and machine learning, robots, whether it's in the field of finance, and you know, there was a whole article a few years back on the robots are coming for Wall Street, as there were new AI systems for helping market analysis. You know, we hear about like how they're going to replace doctors, lawyers, other profession, you know, this notion of fourth industrial revolution. You know, lately we also heard that, like, well, in fact, they're not going to replace us. We're going to, you know, create these super minds, super teams where we're going to be working together. And that AI is going to give us like this extra time, this creativity that we're all longing for. And then let me just, I'm stuck. Okay, and then I think that the other piece, so all of these things kind of tend to be thinking about replacement. They have a kind of a sense of fear behind that, but there's also, you know, a number of interesting new discoveries that seem to have been, you know, connected to AI. So they've been recently, 2 years ago, a whole series of findings, discoveries in the field of antibiotics resistant bacteria, where the researcher were really saying that without AI they wouldn't have been able to figure out these new compounds. And then, you know, lastly, I think that what, you know, we all agree upon is that who gets hired, fired, granted a loan, and who receive medical care is increasingly determined by algorithms and artificial intelligence. And so, you know, that kind of leads to these two dualistic views. So we have the brave new world of efficiency and optimization, where, you know, we're going to have these self-driving vehicles that are going to reduce pollution, traffic, and we're going to have you know, more time for ourselves, etc. And then there's you know, against them in that debate, the world where the algorithm of big tech companies enable a panopticon, and we have Big Brother that is powerful, manipulative, yet largely invisible, and controlling and implementing prejudices over a certain number of people. And so Graham and I were kind of looking at these like different views on the world and on technology, and we were part of conversation with the two groups, and we kind of felt like, can we refuse, you know, this demonization of technology while still taking responsibility for the social relations and the implication of science and technology. And as we were trying to think about like how could we do that, we kind of I won't tell you the whole story of how we got to that point, but we kind of wondered like, can monsters help? And you might be like, why monsters could help. So let me kind of go back a little bit in history and just use a little bit of etymology. Monsters derive from monstrum, the noun form for the Latin verb monere, that means to warn. And then it's associated with monstrare, that means to show or display. And so historically, monsters point out something by signaling or symbolizing. And so if you look at various forms of monsters, historically they're powerful, they're hybrid, and they manifest the unknown. Whether it's a cyclope or a siren or a mara in the Buddhist culture. And then monsters are awe-inspiring, so they produce a feeling of both reverential respect mixed with fear or wonder. And so I think that this mixed emotion is really important. And then, the literature in anthropology and cultural studies really show how there's this kind of connection to the monster. It kind of links, it's the other. And that kind of explains this both attachment and fear that we have for these monstrous forms. And then, more recently, the monster metaphor have been used to reflect on technology and on its impact on human and society by various scholars. And the contemporary go-to technology as monster metaphor really usually refers to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I think that what is interesting in this notion of Frankenstein is that oftentimes people think of it as like this evil brute or this like unthinking creature. But if you go back to the text, the novel of Mary Shelley, it's rather a form, an individual that has been placed in the world by a human creator. In fact, Frankenstein is the name of a creator, not of a creature, that is unable and unwilling to acknowledge and take responsibility for his creation. And so I think that kind of raises the question of like, who is the monster, which, I'll go back to that, but I think is really, really important when we start thinking about AI. So if you go back and you kind of take a stance on all these like cultural and anthropological studies, we see that monsters are a warning of impending danger. They remind us to be responsible for our creation, and they are not necessarily scary or fearsome. And so taking this kind of understanding of monster, we thought of it as like a generative metaphor. And there's a whole literature on metaphor, so we kind of took the Schoen's definition of metaphor as generative, that is providing, way to see things in new ways, and taking it, into account this idea that we could see two things at the same time, like with visual illusion. So maybe we see sometimes we tend to see the vase, sometimes we see the two faces. Can we do both at the same time? And can this metaphor helps us ask questions? And so really what we kind of arguing in this essay is that a technology as monster metaphor can help us ask questions about AI and machine learning, and it may help us move beyond dualistic discussions. That's our hope, and that's where I'd love feedback. And it invites us to move away from solely analyzing facts, but also invites us to kind of bring out the monsters and engage imaginatively with the social, organizational, and the material implication of AI and machine learning algorithm. So what makes AI different? And I think that's an important question, because technology, there's been a lot of debate within the world of people studying technology of like whether AI is that different or is it just one more technology. And then, if AI is different, what are the AI monsters telling us? So, if you think of AI and how different it is from other technology, well, first of all, because of the machine learning component, it's continuously changing. Okay, so that's the reason why oftentimes the data scientists or the developers of AI don't really know why the algorithm is making the decision that it's making, because once you give it the data, then the algorithm keeps learning on its own. Okay, so it's this continuously changing that kind of reminds us, monsters like Hydra with multiple heads, and you cut one head and it can grow again. So that's the first monster. The second one is, I think AI is invisible. As I said, it's in all our way, it's ingrained in our everyday practices, but we don't really see it and think of it. In fact, sometimes it's been sold for this kind of invisibility. Look, you don't have to do anything. It's you can think of text autocomplete, predictive text on your phone, but also personalized advertising and things like that. All of this is invisible. And then another monster, like the siren, it kind of highlights the extreme symbolic value of AI. Okay, it's being sold to us as this wonderful thing that can do all these things, is so powerful, can replace us in all the mundane tasks that we don't want to do, and get us to do really the real work, the creative work, taking away the fact that as it goes, some of our data are being sold, passed away, and that bias and prejudices are like being reproduced over time on certain groups. And then I think that the two other monsters that come up here are like, Frankenstein is very, very relevant. Who is the creator? These algorithms, although they're kind of learning on their own, not always, by the way, but officially learning on their own, are always designed and created by people using historical data. And so the biases that we see, being reproduced by the algorithms are based on biases that were produced by human beings. And so it asks the question of who is accountable. And then, you can also think of who benefits, as these data are being given to some people, to some big companies. Like, what are the power dynamics between, big tech company and other people? And I'll get back to that a little bit later with an example. And then, there's still this kind of like non-scary monster. So when can it help? And without being mischievous, I guess. And this one is the one where I have been, struggling the most with Graham, but I'd love to see if, you have any suggestions. So let's take an example, because I think it's, oftentimes useful to start with an example. So if you think of algorithmic human resource systems, so they've been used more and more, and the claim for it is that the promise is that it's going to increase efficiency, speed, increase number of applicants screened, and the reduction or even removal of individual human resource managers' biases. So that's the kind of a brand new world of AI and HR. And then on the other hand, there's been a lot of studies showing how this system may reinforce societal biases and increase also organizational control. So if you think of that, like take for example an example like AI recruitment tools that particularly use video interviews, okay, and that's being used more and more by multiple companies. And the idea is that you as a applicant, you're going to be the first interview won't be done, the first screening interview won't be done by an HR manager, but would be done by on video and then be analyzed by the AI. And so behaviors like word choice, facial expression, body language, intonation are used to assess the fit of a candidate and generate an employability score, based usually on data from the company. So if you think of that, okay, let's try to see how monsters can help us here. So if you take the monster like the sirens, well, the narrative is that these systems can read people's emotions, and that they kind of allow us, based on this ground truth, to decide who is a good fit, and that it will reduce work for HR managers and increase fairness. And but kind of takes away a number of questions regarding that have been coming up regarding, the loss of expertise on the HR, side, if, you kind of get only to the last point, and then issues about fairness, but we'll get back to that. But if the data, the ground truth and the training data are already biased, you can't really increase any fairness. You're just going to reproduce prejudices. So that's the first monster. The second monster, the monster under the bed. I think that what we tend to forget, so it's that the classification that describe the training data are typically based on decisions that are made by poorly paid crowd workers. So, and I think that's really important, and it goes back to who is the creator. So you have, we often talk about the data scientists or the software developers, but oftentimes there's another group that we don't talk about, that are people who have to create the database, the training data, and usually these are like crowd workers that are in developing countries and very badly paid. And so in a way that then it turns to the human working for the AI to make it better. And then, so I think that's one of the kind of invisible issue here. And there are probably, for sure, many more. And then the idea of this constantly learning and the hydra, I think that the question of like, what is the organizational fit and where does it learn from and how can it be diverse? So if you're thinking of there's a sense of like as if we could define exactly what's organizational fit. And so they've been, I was talking with one of my colleagues who's been studying HR and AI in HR systems. And so it's kind of interesting when, companies are deciding what's their organizational fit and basically looking at like who they have already hired and saying, well, these people are successful, so we want the same people. But on the other hand, they have a discourse about diversity. And so how are you going to be diverse if you're just reproducing the same types of people? And so I've heard, some companies thinking of like maybe, creating this kind of random, selection, but it just feels kind of like, just like cutting ahead and like having another one there. And then I think that if we go back to Frankenstein, algorithmic recruitment tools are grounded on the same assumption that inform previous hiring practices, that we're using cognitive assessments. So I think it goes back to who is the creator, and not forgetting that in a way, we can't just say, either the algorithm, if it's unfair, it's not because of us, it's just like learning, or like, we can, put it on the technology and it's going to be fair for us, because again, this is just a reproduction of previous practices that have been criticized, pre-AI. And then, the kind of a nice monster, I think, is the one that asks questions, that starts conversations and review processes. And there's been a lot of discussions about having these AI guardians, which are like basically people, not technology, but that are there to check, basically what are the classification, criteria, what are the training data of these algorithms, what are the processes. So that would be the 5 way, these monsters could help us think about AI in a different way. So if we're thinking of a monster metaphor, I think it's a useful one as a warning. It's telling us that we need to explore and even contest the value of data and what they reveal or hide. And I think very often people forget that very important part. And so in the design paper we did with Graham, we created a whole workshop with a number of materials to really help designers working with different constituents to think about like what kind of data do we need and how do we define the value of this data. And then it's also a warning in terms of like we need to question the criteria that can or should be used to identify the good candidate, for example, in the context of HR. And I think that's really interesting. Again, back to this colleague of mine who's been studying AI tools in HR. It was really interesting to see that, like, from her studies, most people, HR managers, don't contest the use of AI. You could imagine, you have like suddenly a technology coming in and that is going to take over part of your job, and people just embrace the technology. And then the second thing that was really interesting is that then as they were working with the company, defining the criteria, there were a lot of interesting conversation coming up about like, okay, what are the criteria to define like who is a good candidate? So I think that it's an interesting way of thinking of a metaphor of a helping AI, where you could the good monster who asks you question and forces you to even rethink your practices. And so I think that that's where it can help us reveal the limitation in current hiring practices and assessment tools, and then hopefully reframes the use of algorithmic technologies and machine learning as a managerial challenge instead of a technological one. And then putting the narrative around accountability not on the technology or the people who are designing the technology only, but also on the people who are making decisions in terms of purchasing this technology, implementing them, and using them. So if we step back, what does a monster metaphor tell us? Well, first, I really want to highlight, because sometimes when I've been talking with people who have more of a technological background, they were like, well, we can just bring in diversity in the data sets, or we can improve the accuracy and performance. This is not what this paper is about, and I don't think that's what a monster metaphor does or should do, but it's really for a call for a fundamental reconsideration of the institutions and the individuals that design, develop, deploy this technology in the first place. And so I think it highlights the need to take care of our technologies, and it requires us to be reflective and intentional in our design and use of the technology. And I think if we go back to this notion of a monster as the other, I think it's interesting to think that that AI, just the term artificial intelligence, refers clearly to the human, and so the AI is in a way the ultimate other. And I think that's also the reason why we have like so heated debate about its value, because I think it just like asks a lot of questions about like what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to be ethical and trust and build relationship as humans. So with that, I will close it here and welcome any questions and suggestions.
Thanks, Anne-Laure. That was fascinating. I think it's so interesting the way you approach this. I do have a clarification question that I think I should kick things off with. I was wondering about your choice of this specific metaphor, because monster is such a charged word, right? Usually when people use it, and I'm not even saying when they talk about these mythical creatures or fantasy characters, but when someone says, for example, that person is a monster, it usually just means, this is a horrible person. So I guess my question for you is, to whom is this metaphor supposed to be generative? Are you thinking that it might stimulate thought in academia? Is it for regulators? Is it for the general public? All of the above, none of them, because it might be a bit difficult to overcome this first instinctive reaction to the word monster itself. And so I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
So I think that's spot on. I think that's where we've been, struggling a lot with the concept. But why, I think, maybe I've done too much Latin. I did 9 years of Latin, so I had to, use my understanding of the etymology. I also think, maybe, thanks to my children, I've watched a lot of animes, Japanese animes, and I think in the Eastern culture, the monster is much more ambiguous than in Western culture, and so that always kind of had questioned me, like, why do we really want to always have this dualistic view of it? So I think that's the kind of a biographical explanation of why monsters. And I think that so the audience is really academic, I hope, but also regulators and policymakers, and that's kind of somewhere in a direction where people have been pushing me for, but also, everybody. So I guess it's a difficult one because yes, we tend to see monster as negative, but we also have these images like from kids animation movie, from Cookie Monster and the Friendly Monster. So hopefully we can still turn it around, but I'm still open to, and we've been thinking with Graham of like maybe letting go of a positive aspect of monster, but still I think that even if we don't keep that positivity, it's still generative in the sense that it still offers us ways of asking questions. So maybe we're kind of still struggling with that, and we're on the verge of letting go of like our first part of the claim, which is like they're hybrid and they have this O element, and I think maybe people don't remember the positive aspect of O and they remember only the negative, but I think that's where we are at the moment. So thanks for the clarification question, which is work in progress. So I'd be happy to chat more with you after and see what are your thoughts on that.
Great, thank you. I forgot to remind everyone in the audience, please use the Q&A function to write your comments or questions, and Alan and I will go through them and relate them to Anne-Laure. So Alan, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions about the way that these metaphors get used and what their effect is on the social structures within which we live. So I'll start with an easy one about how they get used. You had an example of how to analyze the use of AI and machine learning in human resource management. And it felt like you had some notion of things that people should be talking about that they're not talking about, and that the use of a metaphor would help them to appreciate that those things were things that they should worry about and question and analyze. So is the role of metaphor here this is the first part of a two-part question, but the first part is the role of metaphor here just to help people to understand there are things they're overlooking? So essentially to give them a broader checklist.
Mm-hmm. You want me to?
Yeah, what do you go with that?
I was waiting for the second part, so I was taking notes.
The second part is it's almost orthogonal, but go with that one first.
Okay. Well, I think that's one part of the question. I think of the role of a metaphor is really kind of helping people think about what are the issues, and also so. I guess back to Rita's question, I think that a lot of people who are implementing, AI kind of tend to buy in only on the kind of the positive story of the sirens, like, we can do all of these things. And I think that there are a lot of things that, they don't see where they could wreck the ship. And I think that there's a number of things. And I think it's also the case with regulators. Although there's, fortunately, a lot of changes in the last couple of years. So I think that's really the first use is really getting people to start thinking about it. But also, as I was saying, is like what we've done with the design part is helping people from different disciplines or different stakeholders talking about it. So in a way, it becomes like kind of a boundary object where, you kind of like let the monsters go, you look under the bed and you figure out what's out there. And we've done a couple of workshops, and it was really interesting to see people thinking about it. And it gives you, a way to go beyond just like it's good or bad, but it's like what's going wrong here. So that's what we've been trying to think of.
So it makes a more nuanced conversation. I will let Rita work through some of the questions on the chat. But another way of thinking about this would be, you're thinking of AI as a sort of social object. You use words like other to refer to it. Mm-hmm. And social objects are things that we create intersubjectively. So are you thinking of this thing that the monster as metaphor discusses as something that exists that we uncover by using the metaphor? Or when we speak in terms of metaphors like monster, and we start to use them to conceptualize stuff like AI, do we actually change the object we're looking at? So might this use of metaphor alter the object that we're concerned with, or indeed even create it?
So I think there's an object that already exists that is part of all our popular narrative. I think it's a great question. I think already also there's and I didn't talk about that because I think it's but there's a piece where we're looking at, like, in the paper also, how even the technical aspect of AI is constructed by, you know, the social relationship between the developers, the different groups, like, you know, who decides what, how do we define the data. So I think that, you know, it's already, we tend to see it as like just an algorithm, whatever is an algorithm, like in our imagination, but it's already socially constructed. And I think that in a way, but I think in a way we're kind of, with the metaphor, allowing people to see the socially constructed part of the object. But you're right, and that's a great. It's a great way of thinking about it. Probably, you know, you're also changing the object as it becomes like, you know, a different way of talking about it.
Okay, Rita.
I think I'll go back to some more clarification questions. There's one in the chat that I was actually also wondering about when you were reaching the end of your presentation. So you mentioned the possibility of rethinking or reconsidering the institutions and individuals that are involved in designing and implementing and deploying these tools. And Alacon Felipe is asking what kind of institutions you had in mind when you made that suggestion. And I guess this is related to my earlier question about perhaps involving regulators, but is this, I would add the question of whether you think that this reconsideration of people and institutions is something that needs to happen bottom up or perhaps top down.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. I tend to think that bottom up is useful, but unfortunately, when it comes to policy, sometimes you also need to have a top down. So I think it's like it's an interesting conversation. But so let me give you an example for the, you know, the institution. So if you're thinking of Compass, which is an algorithm that has been used in the US for in the criminal justice systems to make decisions on, you know, whether defendants were released on bail or not. And so what a study showed was that it was used in the Florida County, and that basically the decisions made by the judges using the output from the algorithm reflected disparities on based on races. Okay, so that if you were black and brown, you were less likely to be released on bail than if not. And these choices didn't reflect, if you were looking really at the history of people, didn't reflect their risk of being, you know, of coming back, of doing another felony. So it was just based on, you know, biases that are like based on the history of who is being sent to jail in the US. So if you're thinking of that, you know, you have a number of people who are involved. The company that is selling the, you know, the system, the people who are developing the system, the algorithm for the company, you have the judges and the judicial, you know, institution who is making decisions on, you know, what is important, and oftentimes also making a decision of like, how much risk do I want to take? Is it better to send more people, to not release too many, like to reduce the number of people you release and maybe be unfair, or like take the risk of like letting, you know, more people on bail and then maybe, you know, 4 times 2 times. So there's like also a societal decision about like what is the right risk as a society. And this is being, I think, for the moment done by, you know, basically a company and probably a few judges. but it's not done by the whole judicial institution, and I would say also citizens who might have to make a decision. So then of course it depends on like the political systems and things like that, but that's what I meant by institutions. So not necessarily like a specific institution, but I think at least like having a conversation at the citizen level. And I think it's the same, you know, in healthcare when you have people who are like, I was following something in, it was a donation for like, what was it? Whatever, it was a system where basically if you were a certain age, you would not get treatment because you were too old, and they would, you know, kind of, and so one guy was like, you know, I've been trying to be really careful for like 30 years, so I'm like really trying to live a good life to not be sick, but then in a way now, you know, I live too long to have a chance to be part of that, you know, treatment. So I think it's and so all of these conversations, so in that case, you know, it was at the state level, and so they decided to have like, you know, the medical institutions and the associations for the family and the patients together to be discussing. So I think that this kind of conversation that you want to have, and that we don't think we're, you know, usually we don't have with this kind of technology.
Yeah, thank you. Alan?
I'm going to rely upon a question from Wiley Wakeman in the Q&A to extend our discussion previously. So we said that when we talk about monsters as metaphors for AI, we're both describing AI and possibly changing the nature of the object that we're talking about. But given that we exist in the context of other things and our relationship to other things, it's kind of interesting to ask whether the extensive use of a metaphor like this and the creative use of a metaphor like this doesn't only change the objects that we're talking about, but because those objects engage with us so pervasively through social media and HR and everything else, whether those things change us and change our egos. So Wiley has examples like AI professionals who see themselves suddenly as people who vanquish a monster, or people who see themselves as beings that communicate with the monster and control the monster. Is this a useful way to think about what you're doing, or is it just stretching it too far?
No, I think it's what I think that's the Frankenstein metaphor. It's really about who is the creator, and some people who think that suddenly they have this kind of, you know, almighty power of like creating this algorithm that, you know, make decisions for others. And sometimes, you know, I think it's also, it raises, I didn't put it in the talk, but I think it raises an interesting question about good intentions. You know, I don't think that people are necessarily, you know, maybe it's me, I have a charity principle for human beings, and I don't think that everybody is evil, but sometimes we do, you know, end up even with good intention in doing wrong things. And I think that these issues of technology, and then, you know, we know there are evil people doing, you know, wrong things with the technology, but I think that there's a whole group of people engaging, like developing these systems, who don't necessarily realize what they're doing, because I think that they're taking it just as a piece of technology and they don't understand the broader context. So that's what we found, you know, in the work with designers, that it was really interesting to work with data scientists and to just like, you know, open up the closet and say, hey, you know, like, have you thought about these things? So no, it's not stretching. I think it's super interesting, and it's going to get me thinking. Thank you.
Good. Okay, Rita.
Thanks. There's an interesting question here from Suzanne Prod, who is asking about the relationship between your approach and the literature on paradox, and whether there might be some advantage in embracing the duality between positive and negative elements in AI in a way that sort of, you know, gets away from an attempt to resolve the conflict completely, and rather accepts the paradox and what it means both for AI's existence in the world and for how we deal with it and how we change the way that we engage with it. Do you think that that's a fair parallel?
It is a fair parallel. I'm not an expert in paradox literature, although we have a whole group of people doing paradox at Nova. So I guess, I felt like I should not go on. But I've been looking a lot at the literature on dialectics, which, kind of is very, that's what we like in academia. We have all these little, but that is very similar. And I completely agree with Susan. I don't think that with a monster metaphor, we're trying to resolving things, but more of like, and that's very why, we're trying to have these multiple metaphors, because I don't think one only works. And by the way, that was my first try of like applying these metaphors, because like usually I just use the concept. And the kind of the invitation that we got from various reviewers was like, can you think of like, imaginatively developed metaphors that would work for AI? So that's really kind of, you having like the first attempt to do that. But no, I completely agree. I don't think we will ever solve it. And I think that for me, and so, maybe I should add that the monsters are paradoxical in some ways, because, that's what I call hybrid. Or I think that they are these things that even those who look just, nasty, the reason why we have this like historically this long relationship with monsters is that we always think that maybe we could be, and I think it goes back to Alan's point, is like suddenly is like, if we had the power of a monster, what would we do in some ways? And so I think that's the kind of interesting questions that are coming up with AI in certain, like, because it's ingrained everywhere and we don't necessarily see the implications.
Thank you. Alan.
Well, I'll have a look back at paradox literature. Thank you, Susan.
So there's a question from Kevin McSweeney, which I think is interesting. Given that the way that you frame, the metaphors that you use can affect speech patterns and affect the way that social reality is constructed, the metaphor you choose is very important. One of the anonymous comments saying maybe a genie would be a nice metaphor to use, given that this is something that's uncontrollable and could be a source for good or evil and maybe hard to control. And Kevin's saying, first of all, do you need one metaphor, or could you talk usefully in terms of two metaphors, superhero and villain, say? And is the choice, he says, given that most people tend to, notwithstanding the cuddly ones that you showed us on the slide, many people tend to think of monsters as something that are negative. Mm-hmm. Is there something loaded in the choice of this metaphor? Does it matter which metaphor you choose?
I think it does matter, and I think that as I said, we've been. I think back to Susan's point, because we like the paradox and we thought that historically there was something paradoxical, and in some culture more than in our Western culture, there's still this paradox in the monsters. And we've been a little bit stubborn with Graham, like trying to, keep trying to see if we could convince people. So we could, probably get to metaphor, but then in a way, we have to figure out like how they're, you don't want to go back to a dualism. So it's very why I try to have like multiple monsters that would be, kind of allowing to look at different aspects or the main dimensions of AI based on the literature review that we've done about AI, but it's a good point. Like I'm not completely close to. I think that I'm not completely sure. Like maybe we could do like have a pair. I think the genie could be also interesting. I think that what we tried a few times with the kind of having a pair, but then the problem of the pair is when we're saying we tried to go beyond dualism and then we have a pair. But which shows that it's really hard for us to think beyond pairs and dualisms. But yes. So yeah, I mean, I'm writing down all these options, and I think I'll do. I'll go back to the drawing board and try to see if what works.
There's actually a really interesting suggestion that just showed up in the Q&A now. One of our attendees is suggesting that the Native American concept of the Wendigo might be a useful monster for your metaphor. as the Wendigo is a monster infected by a corrosive drive toward greed and excessive consumption, with traits that sow disharmony and destruction if left unchecked. And our attendee points out that given how AI is spreading rapidly with little thought or reflection in its wide commercial use, as well as being used in technology by many authoritarian states to surveil and suppress populations, do you think, Anne-Laure, that AI as a Wendigo might fit the monster as metaphor, or might it be too dark?
Well, it's interesting because I started thinking, well, I think I love that metaphor. Like, by the way, can we save the Q&A? Because it seems that there's
we'll give it all to you.
I think it's a super interesting story, and I like the idea of like the spreading around, because I think that's what, I have as the invisible, but I think that it's a mix of the invisible and the continuously changing, and it kind of, creeps. So that could be really interesting. I guess my one question that I have is, it's an open question, is like, we started with this notion of technology as a monster metaphor, which, by the way, there's a whole, literature around that, people who have been looking at cyborgs and Frankenstein and things like that. But then we've been pushed back as like, oh, you can't have like a generic metaphor, you need to have like these multiple metaphors. And so now it's like, maybe it means that we add the Wendigo to the kind of a toolkit of monsters that someone has to be thinking of. I don't know, that maybe that's what it is that it's a complex thing. And so depending on the kind of technology or the kind of groups you use one or the other, I don't know, like maybe it's the Hydra with like multiple monsters heads there. I don't know.
Shapeshifter.
Yes. Yeah, shapeshifter too.
Thank you. Alan.
So we have a comment from one of our attendees pointing at the fact that this might be a useful metaphor to understand what goes on in Senate or Congress when tech billionaires are grilled, and it's clear, the attendee says, that policymakers have little or no idea of what AI does and the risks that it poses. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if this opens an interesting avenue of inquiry. So metaphors can bend social reality when narratives can, and a narrative can shed light on the deeper structure of society and might help us to shape it, but it could also just be wrong, right? So there's a danger, I suppose, that if we pick the wrong metaphor, people start using it to tell stories that under no circumstances could be said to describe the social object that we have. Is that something we should worry about? The possibility that we start using monster metaphors and someone who's not very technologically literate takes them to mean something that they can never mean, and we wind up with misguided public discourse?
I guess it's a great question. I think then it's in a way, it's what we're faced with anything we're doing as human beings and as academics, is like, we're developing things to describe, and then there's always the risk of what it is. So hopefully, as we're so I guess then it goes back to Rita's question of like, who is using it? And so then if it becomes like, kind of a new trope that, I don't know, kind of get over on Twitter or whatever. It's a great question. Then now, but then, my answer to that would be then, what's the option? Not saying anything, or not describing it. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting question that I have to. I guess again, it's my charity principle. I'm thinking that as we start asking questions, we keep asking them. But yes, people can always stereotypes things and use this monster as a way to protect themselves. So yeah, I don't know. I was also thinking about like a question that people like the first part of your question, because I think that when we think of the technology possibilities and the cases, if you think of Amazon, for example, richer during the pandemic as his employees are struggling to keep the minimum wages. while their movement is tracked, well, here the algorithm is not just dangerous to the consumers, but also to the labor involved in the production. And so I'm just like, wondering if there's a way of like thinking of the monster metaphor here also to help us think about like all these different people. And I think oftentimes we've, as consumers, for example, and it's back to, so I'm going back to that question about like, who is using it. We might use the monster only for ourselves, but then there are like the employees who also, are like involved in the use of the algorithm. So I don't, I don't have an answer. I think there's a risk, I guess. Then I think the question is thinking of like, what's the worst risk or the lowest risk in using these things?
Yeah. Rita, do we have time for one more question?
I guess maybe a quick one. So I'll try to pick part of one of the questions we still have here, and I'm sorry we won't have time to get to all of them, but Anne-Laure will receive all of them afterwards. But Gerard Farias is asking about the specific case of social media platforms, and about the fact that some of, if not most of the data that are used to train some of the algorithms that affect so many people's lives come from dodgy sources. Sometimes they're obtained without consent. Sometimes it's a very it's a process that lacks transparency, or that most people don't really understand. Is this a case of us thinking about who the monster is here? Is this a metaphor that might also help us to think about the bright and dark side of the companies that are obtaining the data and using it?
Yeah, so I think it for me it goes. It's a mix of Frankenstein, like who is the creator and who benefits, as also the kind of like the monster under the bed, because it's like a lot of time we don't know where it's coming from, and then so I think it's like in that case it's like these two metaphors helping us thinking about these things. And so I guess back to your original question, Rita, about like who are the, I think it helping end users, but also having them, allowing them, users of social media, but allowing them to go and make claims for transparency to big tech company, and probably get the support of government or civic institutions to help us make these companies accountable for their use of the data and things like that. Ongoing conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I think we're almost out of time. So let me just take this final minute to thank you again, Anne-Laure, and to thank everyone for joining us today and for the stimulating questions and comments. And I'd also like to advertise our next retro seminar, which as usual is going to take place in a couple of weeks. So on the 18th of May. And we're going to have Taiwan Kim from Carnegie Mellon University, who's going to be talking about when it's ethically admissible for AI to lie. So 2 seminars in a row about artificial intelligence, and I hope to see many of you there. So thank you again, and have a lovely rest of the week, everyone.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for your feedback and questions. Really super useful as we're working on this paper. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.